so we're talking about here is tort law. And basically, you want to deal with a situation where it's not related to a contract that you've made with me. It's not a criminal case where you've intended to harm me, take my property away, or shoot me, or something like that. It's basically a situation where there's accidents. I mean, that's basically what's going on. And if we were to just generally look at this, we're looking at an accident in that there's not a breach of contract or we agreed to do something and you failed to do it, nor is it where you've invaded my property right. You actually stole my car. What happened is you crashed into my car. Okay, so how do you deal with that? And again, what's the fundamental thing that we're trying to look at is we're looking at incentives, right? If we make the law this way, here's what the incentives are. If we make the law that way, what the incentives are. And much of what we've been talking about is, can we make it so bargaining is more apt to happen, right? If we can lower the transaction costs, we can start to use costs. If transactions costs are really high, then what we do is you assign the property right, okay? And that means you have to try to figure out who values it the most. Or we try to have things where maybe if we don't quite get it right, there's a method to get around it, right? That is, compensation says, if we say, okay, transactions costs are really high, what we're going to use is the compensation as the method to deal with that. What does that do? It allows you to decide that you are going to go ahead, it's more valuable to you to use this right, and then you compensate me. So it's in a sense, we talked about it as a forced sale, right? So if we make the compensation too high, it may stick with the wrong person, but at least you've got a mechanism to try to solve that problem. So the same thing's going on here. That is, there's basically in an accident, you think about there's these costs of bargaining, right? It's something that happens, boom, right? It instantly happens. You didn't have a chance to say, hey, you know what? If you move your car, or if you don't stop so fast, then I won't crash into you. Can I pay you to actually have, slow down before we get to a problem? And of course, notice that I think Dr. Butter's car. Maybe not. There's somebody I know whose car now has it so it automatically slows you down. Anybody got a car like that? So if you get to, if you start getting too close, it automatically slows you down, right? So we're using technologies to try to reduce accidents. Okay, so the law ought to be is what we're dealing with here, right? And we talked about problems with bargaining. You got asymmetric information. We talked about emotions, like we were talking about divorces and that sort of thing. And so that's something to think about. So we can have contract law when transactions costs are low. I mean, again, it's not rocket surgery here. If we sort of think through the logic of it, when would we use not tort law? If we use contract law, when that's going to happen, if you have low bargaining costs. Bargaining costs, right? That's what contracts are. You and I are going to bargain. I agree I sign a contract with a college every year, right? They agree to pay me. I agree to teach classes, okay? We can bargain with one another. I can say to Dr. Arndt, hey, I really need $500,000 this year to teach these 3 classes, okay? And Dr. Arndt can say, great, we'll do that, right? I don't get quite 500,000, but the point is that you can use contract law when there's low bargaining costs. There's not very many, lots of people you're trying to deal with, and you have defined property rights, et cetera, all those things that we talked about that lower bargaining costs. Tort law is when you have high bargaining costs, right? As I said, if I'm going to crash into your car, it's very hard for us to bargain about what we're going to do, okay? So we'd have some sort of tort law. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to get you to internalize this externality, right? My use of your property, or my use of my property invades your property, harms your property, and we don't have a price system to pick that up, okay? You crash into my car, your use of your property is affecting my use of my property, but we don't have a good mechanism to deal with that. Again, when we were talking about driving along using leaded gas and spewing lead out in the atmosphere, the transactions costs are so high that the government might come in and say, hey, you can't use leaded gas. So here what we do is, this is why would we use tort law. What do we want you to do? We want you to take more precaution, right? And we want you to do what? You want to take efficient precaution. Because if you really think about it, there's a marginal cost of an extra unit of precaution. And there's a marginal benefit, right, of this extra unit. If you drove at 5 miles an hour, let's say you were going to visit your relative in Indianapolis, you could drive at 5 miles an hour, right, and pretty well avoid having any accidents. But it's going to take you a long time to get there, right? And so what we want to do is we want to say, hey, maybe 5 miles an hour isn't the proper precaution. Maybe it ought to be 50 miles an hour. At 50 miles an hour, you have less chance of somebody stopping suddenly in front of you, or a car swerves into your lane. You have less chance of having an accident at 50 miles an hour than at 90 miles an hour. Okay? But you have more chance than you did at 5 miles an hour, but you're going to get there a lot faster. There's an opportunity cost to your time. So what we're trying to do is to get it so that you guys take efficient precaution, in the sense that a little bit extra precaution, if you did it optimally, right? What did you have? You have the marginal benefit of that extra precaution just being equal to the marginal cost of that extra precaution. And of course, it's these things are hard to measure. So if you just sort of think about it, what do we usually do? Right? We usually said, okay, we think the speed limit ought to be 55. Anybody know what the speed limit is on US 12, driving, let's say, from Jonesville to, driving east on 12?
60 miles an hour.
Is it 60? Okay, maybe, I thought it was 55. Maybe there's parts of it that are 60. But anyway, there's a sign there that says, here's what it is, right? But on I-94, it's going to be 70, right? So if you are driving at 70 miles an hour on US 12 and you crash into somebody, there's a problem, right? You weren't taking efficient precaution, right? They're trying to guess what the efficient precaution is, Okay? That's what's going on with speed limits. And so all we're trying to do is say, hey, we want to have a efficient amount of precaution, and we're guessing that 55 miles an hour seems to be about the right amount. But notice, you could be going 55, but if you were swerving in and out, like you're passing somebody, but you cut right in front of them, right? You could still be going the 55, but you could be driving recklessly, right? So what's going to happen is, what you do with tort law is you're going to say, hey, was this person taking efficient precaution is one of the things that they're going to look at, because that's sort of the main reason of this tort law, is to make it so that you take efficient precaution against accidents. So let's think about what you need to do to collect damages. Okay, somebody crashes into your car. Okay, under tort law, to collect damages, that is, you're going to sue me, and I'm going to pay you. If you're going to sue me, there's three things that's got to happen. One is the plaintiff, right? The plaintiff have to have suffered harm. You can't just go, wow, that guy almost hit me. I'm going to sue him because they almost hit me. No, that doesn't work, right? They can't have scared you, unless maybe if they scared you and you had a heart attack, right? That could work. But the plaintiff has to have suffered harm. It can't just be that, wow, this person was driving recklessly and I'm going to sue him for driving recklessly. If they didn't hit anybody, if there was no accident that happened, if nobody suffered any harm, then that's not going to work. The defendant's act or failure to act caused the harm. Okay? It can't be that you did something and somebody else did something and whatever, and the harm wasn't actually done by what you did, right? I'm the plaintiff, I'm suing you, you're the defendant. I have to show that your act or your failure to act, you didn't stop at the stop sign, or you were driving too fast or something like that. There has to be something that I have to show that what you did actually caused the harm. Okay? Maybe if it was a sequence of events or something and you were partly in the middle of it, but your action didn't actually cause the harm, then that wouldn't work. And then the third thing, it has to be a breach of duty. Right? There has to be a breach of duty. And that means that you have to be careful of others. That's really what we're talking about. There has to be that if you're going to sue me, what we need is that the plaintiff was owed this duty by the defendant. That is, they had to be careful, and they weren't careful. Okay? So let's just talk about the first part, which is harm. Okay? So we'll look at number one, this part here. We'll talk about harm. So, maybe we'll just label that A. It's going to be, what's the harm got to be? If you look at it from an economic point of view, what we can do is look at indifference curves, right? So remember, indifference curves are indifferent for indifference and curve for curve, indifference curve, right? And what they do is they look at the trade-off that keeps you with the same utility, right? You're indifferent at any point along that. So if you think about what is an indifference curve, you have the same utility on that curve. And the idea is that if we're going to, in this particular case, we're going to look at wealth on this axis, and we're going to put health on this axis. And conceptually, there'd be some trade-off where you're equally happy with lots of wealth and not much health, or lots of health and not much wealth. Okay? Normally, what if you look at what you're normally doing in an economics class, normally you're doing, good y and good x, and you have some utility level where you have this much y and this much x. To get more x and keep you at the same level, you have to get more y. Now, on indifference curve analysis, higher utilities are farther out this way, right? So you're measuring utility as you go out this direction. You're getting greater and greater utility, okay? Now, why do we draw it, those you had either 402 or intermediate micro or whatever, why does the indifference curve look convex to the origin? Why does it look that way? Anybody remember? Yeah, diminishing margin utility, right? That's why this thing sloped the way it is. And why is diminishing margin utility? How do we measure that? It says that as I get more units of something, I don't add so much to the utility as prior units. Your first, your first drink of water when you're real thirsty, right, adds a lot to your utility. And maybe the second drink of water adds a lot to your utility. But by the time you get to the 12th drink of water, it's not adding nearly as much utility as the first drink or the second drink, right? I mean, so that's just the basic idea that you learn in intermediate micro or the other public finance or public choice when when we talked about it this way. So you got two things going on. One is as you move out that way, you have higher utility levels. And two, as you move along here, you've got the same utility. And notice, why does it have this shape to it? Because if I were to get that much, I have that much y and that much x, okay? Now if I get another unit of y to stay on the same utility, I gotta get that much x. But down here, right, I gotta get a lot more x, which is just saying that in order to, if you're gonna get, in this particular example, in order to get more x, right, you gotta get a lot of x to offset the loss to y when you already have a lot of x. You don't have to get a lot of x to offset that loss of y when you don't have very much x. So the marginal benefit of x is getting smaller, which means when you're and you're getting less y as you go along that way, okay? So the margin utility of y is going up, right, as you get less y, another unit of y, right? So that in this case then, your indifference curves have this convexity to them. Again, you can, I don't know if Professor Clark uses calculus to talk about this, but you can look at the calculus of the thing if you do a utility function, etc. But the bottom line is, what does Rod Stewart say that deals with this? Yes?
Every story tells a picture?
Close. Yeah, every picture tells a story, right? Right? Every picture tells a story, don't it? That was my classic album of the week, all right? Every picture tells a story. So anytime, all these diagrams, all this indifference curve stuff is about just telling a story, right? It's just telling you a story that says you have diminishing margin utility, and that when people get more of a good, they get happier, okay? And they don't get as additionally happy as they get more if they have lots of the good. So all that's going on here is this diagram that's in the textbook is really just to tell you the story and draw a picture of the story. And so what we're trying to do is to say, you cause an accident, and let's say you injure me, okay? How are we going to deal with that, right? How are we going to deal with your actions cause an injury? So what's the compensation got to be, okay? So the point here is that if we started out at some, let's say we start out at U0, right? So you've got some combination of health, H0, and you got wealth, okay? Now what happens is you do something that, so U0 is where you start out. U1 is after the accident, okay? So let's say what happens is if we end up at U1, you end up like here. So now I got H1 and I got W1. Okay? So accident. Once the accident happens, now we're at H1 and W1. Okay? And up here we started out at W0 and H0. Well, conceptually what we're saying is, I want to put you back on the same utility level, right? I want to, and if what I can do is, I can fix whatever happened, then what I could do is I could say, okay, you got to have a way to get me right there, right? So you have to make it so that I've still got the same amount of wealth that I had before and my health has gotten better or gotten back to where it was. That's one way you could do it, right? So what you could do is you could say, you have to pay my health costs, right? You got to pay for the operation. There's some, let's say I broke my leg and I had to have my leg repaired. You get to pay for that, and it restores me back to right there, right? So I'm restored, right? So I'm restored to W0, H0. Now, yes?
So, quick question with this. I might be getting ahead, but what about jobs where proximity to risk is already factored into pay, like being a lineman or underwater welder and stuff like that?
Well, but that's, the question is, what about your underwater diver or something like that? And there's risk to that. But that's not, but the company didn't cause the accident. I hire you to be an underwater, so that's going to be in our contract. It's going to say, here's how much you get paid, and you'll write out in the contract, here's what happens if you have a problem, right? Now, I may buy health insurance for you, right? That says, okay, you get the bends or something like that, and you have to go to the hospital, then that would get, we would have contracted for that. It's not an accident that we didn't contract for. Now, if somebody was driving a boat, let's say you're down there and you've got some sort of device that, the airline comes down from the boat and the person that's driving the boat does something to snap the airline, okay, then that would be the accident. That would have been something that was caused by the person actually doing what they're doing. If it's a matter of a dangerous occupation, okay, you are this thing in the New York Times about this Sherpa. I don't know if you saw this about this Sherpa that climbed Mount Everest 8 times or something without oxygen, et cetera. And he died at, younger age. And now they don't know, well, maybe that was caused by the fact that he was going up and down without oxygen, and et cetera. So there might be something that is within your job. Well, I fought fire for the state of California for 6 fire seasons, okay? Crashed in a helicopter, all right? So we're flying to a fire, lost the tail rotor, and I don't know if you're familiar with how helicopters work, but it's rather inconvenient when you lose the tail rotor because the rotation of the main rotor will make the helicopter spin and go down, all right? So that got embedded in my long-term memory as I still observe the helicopter going like this. But anyway, that was within the job itself, right? It turns out that we were flying from the Sierra Nevadas, the edge of the Sierras where we were at Sanger was the fire station we were at, and we were flying to a fire in the coastal mountains. Well, it turned out that the crash happened before we got to the coastal mountains. We landed in a plowed field, and we came down with such force that it buried the skids, and we just went down, and that was it. Okay, and they just got us off and took us in a fire truck to another fire. But the bottom line is that was something that was part of the risk in the business, right? I don't know that I could have, if I had died, could my parents have sued the helicopter pilot, or could they have sued California? It was then called Division of Forestry, now it's called Cal Fire. Could they have sued them, right? My suspicion is that probably not, right? It was part of what went on with the job. And so the idea of tort law is that there's not an ability to make the contract, right? That would have been in my contract somehow. When I was 18, who knows what I was, probably wasn't reading the contract. But nonetheless, the point is that this is an issue of, was there harm caused, and who caused the harm? And so here we've assumed that whatever happened, the one person caused the harm. So now we're just dealing with, how do you deal with the harm? How do you compensate for that? And the idea is to return the person to their same utility level. If they're capable of doing healthcare services that move them back to their same healthcare, then you'd have to pay for that, right? So essentially, you'd pay the healthcare costs, okay? But then what happens if you can't get to that? What happens if they can't be restored? Right? There's a permanent damage. Your leg gets, you're driving your motorcycle, somebody crashes into you, you lose your leg, they have to cut your leg off. They can't, they can do maybe a prosthetic, but they can't stick your original leg back on, okay? So what if you can't get back to age 0? Well, if you can't get back to age 0, then what has to happen? Then you have to, right, go to here. We'll call it W star maybe. You gotta, if they're stuck at H1, there isn't something that they can get you back to there, then what has to happen? Then they're going to have to not just pay for your hospital expenses, okay, but they'll have to compensate you on top of that, all right? So in this case, then our little picture, our picture is telling a story. What does this picture say? It says that here's where we are to start with. You caused the accident, dropped me down to this utility level. I got to get you back to, or you caused the accident, so you got to get me back to my original utility level, which means you got to restore my health and so I still have the same amount of wealth going around, which means you paid for my hospital expenses or whatever. If there's something that happened that can't restore me to here, you're going to have to pay me not only my hospital expenses, but you're going to have to give me some compensation on top of that. Okay? So basically what we're saying here then is that you have to compensate plus pay for the healthcare costs. So how much compensation then gets you back to the original utility level? Okay. Again, there's going to be a difficulty in trying to figure that out. Right? Remember we were talking about compensation earlier. Does somebody have to compensate for you? Compensate you? How or should we have compensation or injunction? Right? In terms of your invasion of your property rights. Here, what's happening is in an accident is that how to measure compensation. And what can you be compensated for? Let's say you were a movie star, and you had some sort of brain injury that made it so that you couldn't be in movies any longer. Okay? We would have to look at, okay, what is the proper compensation to stick you back to your utility level before? Okay? How am I going to measure what the loss in your future earnings could be? So you can see that again, you've got these trade-offs. You don't have an exact answer. What are you trying to? So that just brings you back to what are you trying to do? What you're trying to do is have people take efficient precaution, right? I mean, all these, everything that we're talking about, we're trying to get people to have an efficient allocation of the property value or the property, right? Externalities was what it was about, making sure that the people who valued the property right the most end up with it. That's what we'd like to do. Can we actually do that? Well, not all the time, right? So let's figure out ways that will make it more likely that it shows up, right? If we can reduce transactions costs, then we can use the Cost Theorem, and it will affect the income distribution, okay? And that will affect a lot of things, maybe, but we'll know that the right goes to the person who values it the most if we reduce those transactions costs. So here, what can you be compensated for will affect how much precaution people take. So oftentimes there's a limit. It could be limited, compensation could be limited to what we call tangible. Tangible losses. That is medical bills, the loss of future income, like we were talking about. You couldn't go to work for 3 years. So we're going to compensate you for the loss of your work for 3 years, etc. Okay. There could be, and again, state law is what determines this. But can you do what's called pain and suffering? Right? Could I say, hey, this really caused me lots of distress, and I'm depressed about what happened, and so not only do you have to pay for my medical bills, not only do you have to pay for the loss of income that I otherwise would have, but I have this distress I'm worried about things now that I wasn't worried about, etc. And so I've got pain and suffering. It's generally, it's sort of moved about in terms of generally do we allow for pain and suffering, or generally do we not allow for pain and suffering? Sort of, as I mentioned in the textbook, there's been movements in both directions over time. But again, what's the trade-off here? The trade-off is, how do you measure that, right? Because again, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get you to take the proper amount of precaution. And if what happens is I require you a whole lot of compensation, what's going to happen? You're going to take up too much precaution. You're going to use up resources taking precaution where the marginal cost of those resources is less than the marginal benefit of the precaution. So the problem with pain and suffering, of course, is it's very difficult to measure. And I could easily make it so that I'm making you take more precaution than is efficient, because that's what the law is really trying to do. So do I allow for pain and suffering? But is it really part of this indifference curve, right? If the pain and suffering is actually reducing your utility, then that was part of the cost of the accident. And you should have been thinking about that when you were deciding how much precaution to take. Okay? If you know what the law is, I mean, again, you need to know what the law is. Just as we said that, if you got to know what the property rights are. Why do we establish, want to have clear property rights so that you know what you're supposed to be doing? Similarly here, if you need to know, is pain and suffering something that you have to compensate for? Now, again, how many in here know whether you can be compensated for pain and suffering in the state of Michigan if there's an accident? Yeah, see. That's sort of our, sort of the bigger question of rational ignorance, right? If we think back to ECON 105 or whatever, that people are rationally ignorant about things, right? If the marginal benefit of learning about something is greater than the marginal cost, then you might not do that. Or in public choice, what do we talk about? How much do people know when they go in to vote? Right? And do they read all the platforms of everybody? You probably all watched the full 2 hours of the debate last night, right? Yeah. It was fun for about 30 minutes, right? You get the idea what's going on. I don't know. I did watch part of it. But so what was the idea in 415 was you're rationally ignorant about this stuff. That's similar to the law. If you don't know what the law is, then are you likely to take efficient precaution when you don't even know whether people can be compensated for pain and suffering? But theoretically, that's basically what we're doing in here, right? How can we use economic analysis to try to make the law as efficient as possible? If people are aware of whether folks could be compensated for pain and suffering, it would affect their amount of precaution that they're taking. So, bottom line is that the difficulty in measuring it has to be part of the analysis when you're trying to, should you be able to be compensated for pain and suffering? On the one hand, theoretically, that may be necessary to move you back to the indifference curve, right? It may be that we can compensate you for lost pay, and maybe we can compensate you for your medical bills, but you're just bummed that whatever happened. Can we compensate you for that? So theoretically, you should be able to do that, right? Theoretically, we're trying to restore you back to U0, but when you try to do it, is it so difficult to measure that the errors there are going to cause more precaution than is efficient? All right. so let's just go, well, this last part is that you could get different awards for different, you could get different awards for the same injury, depending on how you structure the law, right? And that is, if I allow for this pain and suffering, one person could have the exact same accident and the exact same problem, and they get paid in terms of compensation differently than this other person over here, because they've got this pain and suffering part. So what is that going to do? That's going to create uncertainty, right? Where you're going to create, you don't really know what the costs are going to be if you cause this accident, right? And so from a theoretical perspective, by allowing for pain and suffering, the advantage of doing that is moving somebody back to the same utility level. One of the disadvantages is I could get different awards for the exact same accident, so I don't really know what I'm going to have to compensate for. So I've created this uncertainty, which means that it's difficult for me to figure out what the efficient amount of precaution is. All right, so that takes care of this section. What we're going to do, as I said, for Friday, we will, you guys can bring in questions and the like. If nobody brings in any questions or whatever, what we'll do is we'll move our way through chapter 6 here, and the next part of that is a discussion of cause, and then we'll talk about the breach of duty, and then we'll talk more about the economic theory behind tort law. Yeah.
And then when's the review again on Saturday?
Now what?
When is the review again on Saturday?
I think the review's at 2. Is that right? Yeah, the review's at 2 o'clock, and it'll be in here.
All right.
Okay, and I'm going to attempt to Zoom it. So 75% of the time that works out. We'll see. And if I Zoom it, then you can get I can send you a link, and it records automatically and is stored in the cloud for a while.